On to The Voice. We know we're all sick of talking about this, but today's article in The Australian is really juicy because it gets to the heart of the matter. The Australian tells us that treaty between Australians and Indigenous Australians is set to cost us millions and millions of dollars apiece. So keep in mind there's over 800,000 Indigenous Aussies here, and we'll factor in the number of Indigenous people killed in historic local massacres as Queensland looks to New Zealand and Canadian governments to guide its new reconciliation laws. Of course, this comes just days after Queensland passed a treaty, which is now being dubbed as the standard. We know New South Wales is looking at doing the same. WA's way ahead of the game. Victoria is galloping up to WA. The race seems to be on. But this is unconscionable, the amount of money that we're looking at spending. And it raises the question, Caleb, why do we need a nationwide referendum on this when the states are clearly hell-bent on taking matters into their own hands?
Well, and there's no opposition. I mean, in Victoria, for example, that you mentioned there, I mean, the opposition in Victoria has already given its in-principle support to the body that's going to go out and try and negotiate these treaties. We don't actually know what these treaties will lead to. They could possibly lead to reparations, as we talk about here, and we know that that's ultimately what they want. It's what people like Lydia Thorpe want. She doesn't want a voice to Parliament. She wants a treaty because she thinks that's where the money is and that's where the real benefit is. Does it mean treaties? Does it mean having to give land back? Nobody knows. This is uncharted territory. And for us to be walking into this so blindly as we are, with states pursuing it as though it's the right thing to do, we are opening a can of worms that once the top is even just half a centimetre open, you will not be able to shut it.
Well, I take your point, but I disagree with you slightly. You say no one knows. I think everyone knows. It's all those things you mentioned and more. And you make a great point that there's no opposition to these ideas, because I wonder, when did we get asked about this? When did we vote about this? But of course, we haven't been asked because the political elite have all agreed this is what's going to happen. And so you're going to have people many generations removed from, the horrors of colonialisation or whatever you want to call it, being compensated by people whose, for the most part, families weren't even here when any wrongs were done. And what I'd like to know is whatever amount is issued or given ultimately, will the $30 billion that taxpayers now spend annually on Indigenous affairs be deducted from that?
Yeah, well, we know the answer to that, don't we? But Mr Crawford, Craig Crawford, who's the relevant minister in Queensland, has literally said anything is on the table. Yep. And within Queensland itself, there are 150 Indigenous nations. That's 150 just in the state of Queensland. And he's saying each of them can ask for anything. Nothing's off the table. Now, that isn't to say anything would be granted, but he's talking about, he's said the renaming of places, changes to the curriculum, changes to the criminal justice system, health, terms around adopting and fostering Indigenous kids, which we already know is absolutely, that's a mess already. It's just unbelievable.
You know, something I thought was really interesting in that article was they talked about how our politicians are looking to Canada and New Zealand for a bit of a guide as to how this can all be worked out. And in the course of explaining this in The Australian, they said the New Zealand Maori economy is worth $68 billion. So that's money that Maoris have been given as part of treaty settlements, and they've invested specifically. But what I thought was interesting is you've got a race-based economy, the Maori economy.
Exactly.
Do we really believe we're going to reconcile and unite the country by creating race-based economies, which is what would happen here?
It's interesting you use that word, reconcile, because we always talk about reconciliation. Now, I've got no issue with reconciliation, the idea being that we sort out our differences and become one people. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about division. This flies directly in the face of the idea of reconciliation because it's constantly pointing out how different we are and how wrong certain people are and the money they deserve, rather than saying, yes, things were done in the past, but now we want to move on and be one nation together. That's not what this is.
Exactly.